Welcome to Nick's Knacks. I'm Nick, and today's knack is a cool camera. In fact, it's the best camera in the world, the Nikon F5. I'm just kidding, unless you're looking to use your camera to defend yourself against an angry bear while shooting 8 FPS Panavision movie film of it attacking you on the very last roll of Fuji 400H. And I'm literally not kidding, you can in fact take 8 FPS movies on this camera for about 4.5 seconds until you exhaust the entirety of your 36 exposure roll of 35mm film. And yes, we're off topic, but, you know, my channel, not yours. I will of course be covering the Hasselblad V System, the world's best camera. The Hasselblad system, or the V system as it was known after Hasselblad began introducing other systems besides their original system, is a modular medium format film camera produced from 1948 to 2013. First off, why should you care about the Hasselblad V system? If I'm being honest, you probably don't. It's just 3 a.m. and this came up as a suggested video, and you're probably not the kind of person that spends $2,000 on a random old medium format film camera. But this is my channel, so today we're going to talk about it. But really, these cameras have a number of qualities that make them somewhat unique, or at least intriguing. Because this is art, the feng shui of the camera is very important, and oh boy does the V system bring the feng. First, most common V-series cameras are entirely manual. They are precision engineered and quite beautifully designed around a particular workflow. There's no automation to get in your way or to help you. So I trust you can focus a 150mm lens with an old ground glass split prism, meter a scene with 7 stops of dynamic range on some slide film. They are often used with a waist-level viewfinder like this, so the photographer often takes the photo looking down at the camera from the middle of the abdomen. This can create some interesting perspectives relative to a typical camera, which is held at eye level. They're also quite distinctive-looking, uncommon cameras. People know what they are when they see them. I've received, "Ooh, Hasselblad" comments from many passerbys, including professional photographers while shooting one. People don't usually buy this camera nor wander around with it without a pretty good reason to do so. It's expensive and difficult to use, and getting good, reliable results with them requires quite a bit of good old-fashioned film photography skill. These cameras have also taken some of the most famous pictures in history, like this one called Earthrise, taken on Apollo 8 while it was orbiting the moon. It was taken on a special Ektachrome film stock developed by Kodak for the moon missions themselves, using a modified 500 series EL motorized body, and actually this 250mm f5.6 sonar telephoto lens. Same with Ansel Adams' Moonrise over Half Dome. Side note, it is pretty cool to own the exact same model of lens that took these sorts of pictures. This is also a high-quality camera system. You're not going to grab one of these lenses and be disappointed by its performance. They're all really great. The other cool thing about these cameras is that they're modular. You can attach a digital back instead of film. For the modest sum of $6,400, you can turn this into a digital camera. Prism viewfinders are available, which flip the image and provide open-loop exposure meters. You can also carry multiple film backs, so you can have 2 of these with 2 different types of film stock loaded in, color and black and white. Or if you're super crazy, you can go all Ansel Adams with multiple different developments for different black and white film contrast numbers for the zone system development. The combination of the lenses and the 6x6cm medium film format provides amazing quality. You're not going to find an ergonomic camera that shoots a whole heck of a lot higher quality than the images you're going to get with this right here, unless you're try hand-holding a speed graphic using that little quick action finder. Watcha! A sharp negative or slide on 6x6 has a truly massive amount of resolution, not to mention that you can use longer lenses for the equivalent angles of view, giving you better bokeh. Bokeh? Bokeh. I give up. There are no true medium format 6x6cm digital sensors. The closest we have is near 645, and then again, it doesn't actually really hit that dimension. So if you want true 6x6 shooting experience along with the full angle of view that these lenses can offer, you're still stuck shooting film, unfortunately. These are also just fun. They're a totally different experience than most of the other cameras you'll work with. And the results can be absolutely fantastic. They just mint beautiful images when used correctly. The long focal length creates the real portrait mode, and not to mention the 6x6 format is the original Instagram. These are sufficiently rare and sufficiently not made anymore that finding one can be a little bit of an adventure. I managed to source one locally on Craigslist from a pro photographer. It was a 503 CW. But after I got it, I realized there was a problem with the shutter timing and the lens needed what's called a CLA, a cleaning, lubrication, and adjustment. These can be a little bit annoying to acquire and take on the order of months to do, so I ended up returning that. The shutters on many of the V System cameras are actually inside the lens here, so each lens must be carefully calibrated, timed, and adjusted individually for the shutter performance. The camera body itself in the middle here actually ends up being just basically a body with a little flappy mirror inside. The shutter on the back is actually just a light blocking shutter for when you're focusing. It doesn't actually do the shutter when you expose the film. So I ended up returning that kit and acquiring this one on eBay, which is a 500 CM with the 150mm f4 that had been recently serviced. If you're acquiring one of these on eBay, or anywhere else for that matter, you're going to want to make sure that there's a return policy offered. And it would be preferable to have some kind of evidence of recent service on the camera. If they just say it was CLA'd, it probably wasn't. The seller probably cleaned it, as they say, with a rag. You should make sure when you get the camera to test all the shutter speeds, all the functionality when you receive it to make sure everything is working. Don't do what I did and wait till like 2 weeks down the line to go ahead and make sure the 1 second is actually 1 second long. This is a 500 CM, which is an earlier version of the 500 series. There are several differences between these 500 series bodies. The M in 500 CM means modifiable focus screen. That means that the focus screen in the middle here is actually user replaceable. So you can pull out these tabs and swap it in. A lot of these newer ones, especially the nicer focusing screens like the Acute Matte D, run you like literally $500 to $600 on eBay. So prepare yourself if you're going to buy one. Some of the cameras have a longer floating mirror, which improves the light fall off in viewfinders with longer lenses. These are ones like the 503, and then I think a later version of the 501 received this floating mirror design as well. Cameras with a W in the name are compatible with battery-operated winders. To me, this seems pretty useless because, in my humble opinion, the crank is the best part about using this camera. Some have argued getting newer bodies is better from parts availability. I think this applies mostly to the original 500C. There's some notes that David Odess has about servicing the 500C and parts availability. You're going to want to do a little bit of homework on this before you just jump in and buy one of these things. Beyond the 500 series, which is kind of the most common Hasselblad series, you have several other cameras available. There were some focal plane cameras that actually had a bona fide shutter in the back of the camera. The earliest V System cameras fell into this category. This was the 1600 and the 1000 series. These are basically junk at this point because reliability concerns. The shutter just didn't hold up to field use. After that, you've got the 2000 series, which was introduced in the 1970s. Those are still available and still functional, but the reliability is a little bit suboptimal. And then lastly, you've got the 200 series, which was introduced in the 80s and some of the bodies in the 90s. If you think the 500 series is expensive, just wait until you feast your eyes on the price tag for a 205 FCC body with no accoutrement, which included aperture priority matrix metering and auto bracket functionality along with TTL flash and an electronic data bus. Ooh. To properly utilize all these features, you're going to need an E lens and an E back. Each had electronic data bus connectors to communicate data. In the case of the lens, it was the aperture setting, so the body could know what aperture the lens would stop down to once you hit the shutter button. And in case of the back, you could actually set the ISO on the back itself, and the camera would read it. So if you were swapping in between different film backs, you could change ISOs automatically without even thinking about it. Masterful. There's also a special ultra-wide camera. So as a nature of the fact that these cameras have a gigantic and very long body here with the mirror in it, it's very difficult to make wide lenses just due to the minimum distance in between the flange and the film plane. So there was a dedicated camera with a separate viewfinder that could use Hasselblad backs with very wide photography. Also note that some lenses were compatible only with the focal plane bodies. The main reason to get a focal plane body like the 2000 or the 200 series are a couple of the coolest lenses that the Hasselblad system offered, specifically the 110mm f2, regarded by some as the greatest portrait lens of all time. I'm not sure how many lenses have that honor because I thought prior to this that it was the 135mm f2 DC from Nikon in 1990, but you know. The other major advantage was the 1/2000th shutter speed. So the 500 and the 500 series bodies stands for the maximum shutter speed you could get using the leaf shutters in these lenses, which is typically 1/500th of a second. This was pretty limiting outdoors. So at the end of the day, having 2 extra stops by stepping down to 1/2000th can help you shoot at open apertures while you're outdoors or in changing light conditions. These 500 series bodies were used a lot more commonly in studio settings, and as a result, the flash sync of the leaf shutter was a lot more important to them, and they didn't care so much about outdoor exposure times and things like that. Just be aware that lenses without the F designation cannot use a focal plane shutter, although you can use a C lens on an F camera by disabling the focal plane shutter itself, with one exception. I think the 202 or something like that. I don't know. There are several different lens series. You've got the original C lenses, like this, with a Bay 50 filter on the front of it, which is kind of cool. And these lenses have an internal leaf shutter or contour shutter, hence the C. The leaf shutter is required for the 500 series cameras without focal planes. The earliest lenses, which are often silver in color, are often not coated. Lenses that have a T star written in orange will have a multi-coating. For those not familiar, multi-coating is a method to incrementally change the refractive index with one or more intermediate refractive materials, which minimizes the reflections at the edge of the glass surfaces within the lens. Lenses with coatings will be darker and exhibit colored reflections when viewing in the light, whereas this ancient Tessa lens off of my speed graphic doesn't have any coating, and therefore the reflections are clear. The coating will help reduce internal reflections, increased contrast, and reduced ghosting, especially when viewing high contrast subjects like shooting into the sun or with larger lenses that have more elements and surface areas inside them. Lenses with the F in the name, like CF, have an additional setting to allow them to be used with focal plane cameras. This disables the internal shutter and allows you to use it with the focal plane. Lenses with CFI are improved, obviously. Lenses with E, like CFE or FE, have electronic data bus connectors on them, used to communicate the aperture to the camera for metering on cameras that had built-in light meters like the 203, 205, things like that. Lenses with no C, as in like an F lens, are not compatible with the 500 series bodies. If you buy one of these, not going to work. I almost accidentally bought the 250mm f4 instead of the f5.6. With each of these lenses that are F, you usually get about an extra stop. So they make a 250mm non-C lens, it's just an F lens, and that lens has f4 instead of f5.6 on the C lens. Just so happens that with the shutters built in, it was harder for them to make lens designs with wider apertures. I have several lenses that I've acquired. The 50mm Zeus Distagon f4, the standard lens, the 80mm planar f2.8, my personal favorite, the portrait photography standby, the 150mm Sonar f4, and this Sonar 250mm f5.6, the Ansel Adams Moonrise lens. All my lenses are C lenses with a T-star multi-coating, except the 150mm, which is a CF. Obviously, the fastest lens in the set is the 110mm f2, but this lens is only available in the non-C focal plane setup, so it requires a focal plane camera, and it seems to run in the neighborhood of about $2,500 on eBay from Japan. I have not found any available locally in the US. For fast and low light shooting, I'll probably stick with digital. I usually shoot a 135mm f2 DC, but I may switch that to a different lens because the former is a little bit soft, wide open at f2, so you kind of have to shoot it at 2.8 or 2.4. Two of my lenses, the 80 and 150, appear to be the later models that have the Bay 60 filter adapter. The 250mm is a Bay 50, and the 50mm is something else. I think it's a 72mm or 67mm filter thread. I was hoping they'd be consistent, but apparently that's just luck of the draw. You get kind of random filters on random lenses. The standard viewfinder is a waist-level viewfinder like this. They come with a handy magnifying glass that flips up like that. The focus screen I have installed is a split prism plus little criggly, crackly pattern focusing aid down at the bottom. I also acquired, for no good reason, a PME 90 Prism Viewfinder. The aesthetic is a little off compared with the original vintage 500 CM, but it does provide some modicum of metering through the lens. I learned after I got it that the spot meter only works on focusing screens with no focusing aid, which is a bummer, but such is life. The PME 90 also has an incident light meter dome as well as center-weighted and spot metering capabilities, provided the correct focusing screen is used. The manual warns that differing focus screens other than the original ones it specified may require exposure compensation. This isn't a sure shot point and shoot camera, unfortunately. Also on the film back side, you're going to want the A12. It stands for automatic 12 film backs. They are, like every other aspect of this system, expensive as the dickens. They are quite well designed though, and have features like locking the shutter after the 12th frame has been exposed. One note, now that 220 film is dead, you can supposedly use a 120 film in a 220 back. It's called the A24 back. The caveat is that you're only going to get 11 frames of film on the actual roll, and it will not stop you. You'll just be able to shoot right onto the paper past the 11th frame. I have not personally verified this myself, but I'll let you know if I get around to it. The Hasselblad 500 series shooting workflow is, as expected, entirely manual. First, you're going to need to acquire all your accoutrements. You have the camera itself with a focusing screen installed. This is just your mirror and your little shutter on the back. You've got your film back. You've got your viewfinder adapter of choice, either one of these waist level viewfinders or a prism, if you so desire. You've got your lens here. You can install the lens by aligning this orange mark up here at the top with the red dot inside the camera. You're also going to want to make sure that each of these little screws on the lens and on the camera are pointed towards the red dot. When you separate these, they're meant to be installed in the cocked position, and if you remove them and one of these gets triggered by pushing on that pin or something like that, you won't be able to mount the cameras correctly, and you'll have to use a little screwdriver or wind the camera to cock the shutter here. These things do jam from time to time. That's just kind of part of the fun. So you rotate the lens and lock it in like that. And now we load the film. So loading the film here is a super duper adventure. The Hasselblad uses 120 roll film. It comes on little rolls like this with the paper here. This is a roll that my camera literally chewed to death. But basically you'll have your film here that is taped to the inside of a black paper leader like this. So in order to load film into this camera, you're going to want to first lift the tab, rotate it here, and slide it out. You're going to want to make sure this dark side is in the correct direction, so it should face away from the insert here, otherwise it will get caught when you try to pull it out. There should be an empty spool inside the film back. If not, that's tough luck. This needs to be moved to the take-up side. So the gear here is the take-up side, and you're going to want to move it from the other side to the take-up side and align it like this. Now you'll be able to insert the film into the back. So you take your 120 roll film, you remove the little paper from the film, and you unwind it. The key thing here is you're going to want to put the film in backwards relative to how you think you should. So the tab should face towards the middle here, and you're going to actually unwind it backwards around the pressure plate. Now tuck the tail into the take-up spool and wind it until the line, the black line on the back of the leader paper, matches up with the red arrow here on the metal. Now take the whole caboodle and push it in here into the film back. You're going to want to hold this latch in the open position, otherwise it won't mesh properly. It usually takes some wiggling to mesh the gearing, and you'll want to make sure the paper is reasonably taut so it doesn't catch on anything. You can pop the dark slide out a little bit to help pass it underneath the far pressure plate. Now, latch the insert, flip the bad boy over to the other side, and you're going to want to use this little crank here until it stops. You should see a 1 here in the viewport, at which point your film is loaded. Easy as pie, right? Actually, it's pretty arcane, but hey, this is not the camera you get for turnkey program automatic Wi-Fi uploads. Now that your film is loaded, you can attach the back to the camera. Just mate the little feet on the bottom here with the tabs on the bottom of the film back, and then slide this on. You can push the latch over to the side to make sure it meshes properly. You can just kind of slam it onto the camera, but, you know, expensive and all. So at this point, you're ready to go. So first, you're going to want to remove the dark slide from the camera. Thankfully, this camera is actually clever enough to prevent you from taking a frame with it installed. You're going to want to go ahead and stash this somewhere safe. With the newer backs, there's actually a nifty dark slide holder attachment in the back. With the older backs, you just got to kind of say a dark slide prayer, I guess. Given my current understanding of the pricing of this system, the metal dark slide will probably cost $7,000 on eBay to replace if you lose it or damage it. So it would appear that some people actually do make a dark slide holder attachment for the older backs that you can kind of stick on with double-sided tape, and it'll hold the dark slide in the back there. I think it's on eBay. Go poke around there. On exposure, you've got a pretty standard leaf shutter with bulb setting over here, and 1 second all the way to 1/500th of a second in one-stop increments. You cannot do half stops on the shutter. Your aperture slider is going to be adjacent here, and will go in half-stop increments. On my 150mm lens that appears to be newer, the 150mm CF, there's a button you can press which actually locks the shutter ring and the aperture ring together. On the two older lenses, they actually seem to be permanently coupled, so you have to actually release them in order to rotate them independently, which is a bit weird, and I've never seen this before. So as best I can discern, what you're supposed to do is dial in the exposure value by looking at the side of the lens here. This arrow will point to your exposure value after you meter. And then you can select your aperture and shutter speed combination, and by holding that button, you'll be able to select all the valid combinations of aperture and shutter speed, which will match that exposure value. It's kind of nifty. It's a different shooting methodology. I don't typically shoot this way, as I'm often kind of tweaking by a half stop depending upon what I'm shooting, but it would enable kind of cool things like depth of field bracketing. And I'm sure it would be a lot more useful in a studio setting where the exposure was more or less fixed. So next, you're going to want to focus. For those of us that are not aged pros at manual focus, it's quite a skill, and it's increasingly important with very long lenses like a 150mm f4 on the Hasselblad. It's going to have a paper-thin depth of field. The focusing aid here is going to be your friend. For most portraits, I find the crackle pattern to be most useful if you go over the eyelashes. And for any architecture, the split prism is typically useful if you've got a line that you can follow. Definitely take time on the focusing step, especially if you're shooting portraits. Focus being off half an inch with a portrait will completely ruin the picture, the sharpness and everything. You can see plenty of examples of failed focusing on my recent rolls of film. It's probably worth honing your focusing technique and practicing it over a few rolls. This used to be part of the job for professional photographers, especially the pros that used to somehow shoot sports with a manual focus telephoto lens. I have no idea how that worked, but it's a bit of a lost art today, unfortunately. You can then compose. Obviously, the waist level finder is going to have a mirrored image, which is different. I found that leveling the camera was a little bit weird. You know, I tend to, in some of my pictures, as you can see, have it askew by a couple degrees. So you want to pay a little bit of attention to that. This isn't really a video on how to compose pictures, so you can go figure that out on your own. A few notes on the shutter. You'll want to hold down the shutter for the full length of the exposure. This is mostly an issue with long exposures. The leaf shutter in the front operates independently of the mirror, so if you release the shutter early, it will cut off an exposure before it's done. Also, the one major bummer about this camera that I discovered is that typical cable releases won't thread into it, resulting in some ridiculous hacks to make these work. Also, you know, you do have a giant mirror slapping around in this camera, so for a couple shots I have aimed, then you can fire the mirror release on the side here, and then you can fire the shutter separately with the camera braced. You can also use this strategy on a tripod, especially if you've got kind of an intermediate length exposure. After you expose your frame, you'll get to do the best part of having this camera and crank. Just listen to that noise. The camera will not let you detach the lens without winding the shutter, so make sure your lens and camera are wound before you detach them. There have been a few times where I managed to get the camera sort of stuck in limbo where the mirror released and the shutter didn't fire. I believe this can happen when the lens is not correctly seated, so if that happens, you're going to want to start detaching things. Wiggle to make sure you actually seated the lens all the way. And then I was able to fire off a shot, rewind the camera, and then everything was good. These do jam though, and there are some techniques for unjamming them if that does happen. Getting into some fun alternatives, there are a variety of cameras and grips you can get with the Hasselblad. One of the cooler ones is the pistol grip. They also made shooting brackets with cable releases, and one actually quite important note, Hasselblad relocated the big screw thread here on the bottom of the camera between some of their different models. The 500 cm has the thread here, whereas some of the other models have a thread further to the front. As a result, some grips won't work, so the pistol grip will work on this, but the bracket I got does not fit. This is pretty inane, but such is life. Ergonomically, the pistol grip is going to pair well with your PME 90 pentaprism like this, so you can hold it up at eye level. The metering mode of the PME 90 is, again, a little bit of an adventure. You're going to want to set your film speed and your max aperture here. Then you can configure whether you want exposure value outputs or some guesses at program automatic or other priority exposures. Any metering is going to have to be transferred to your lens externally on the 500 series. You don't even get any visibility into what your lens settings are set at through the prism like they do with like the Pentax KX, but probably an external meter is going to be a little bit easier. Sometimes it can be nice to just double check exposures while you're framing, but this is still quite cool. If you want real auto exposure, you're going to have to get one of the incredibly expensive 200 series models. To me, the major value of a prism would be the ease and reliability of focusing. I just kind of wanted to burn money on this PME 90 for fun. There are cheaper prisms, especially those that have a meter that just died. So if you're just looking for composition, cheap ones are available online from KEH and stuff. So after you fire off your last exposure, the A12 back will lock the shutter release when you're out of film. I actually once handed the camera to my mom out of film to take her first frame, and she's like, the button won't press. It's so hard. And that's when I realized. You can then wind the film all the way to the end until you feel it come off the spool, like that. You'll need to reinsert the dark slide if you want to detach the film back. I find it easiest to remove the film and to handle this while the back is off the camera, but it is not necessary if you can contort yourself depending upon your ergonomics. And then you just pop it out and your roll's done. Now all that remains is to process your film, and you should be good to go. I'd recommend you hit up a local pro lab in your area. You can alternatively get mail order service. The labs usually offer film scanning and cutting and sleeving at the time of processing. Some other cool things, there's actually a Kickstarter project right now to create an Instax mini back for the Hasselblad V System, which I think is pretty cool. You can check out their Kickstarter. Hopefully it will materialize. It's a bit tragic that the 110 f2 lens doesn't work with the regular V System cameras. These are generally known as the more rugged and reliable cameras, and these are expected to be serviceable for a much longer period of time than the 200 series and 2000 series. Those two have been discontinued for longer, and a lot of the parts are getting harder and harder to get. Also, although I spent the better part of a decade depressed that a good tungsten-balanced high-speed color film doesn't exist, I was blown away to discover 800 speed tungsten stock is now available in 120 format from a company called Cinestill. It would appear that these crazy bastards got their hands on unperforated 70mm Vision 3 500 tungsten balanced stock and shoved it into 120 rolls. And God bless them for doing it. Supposedly the C41 process gives this film closer to 800 ASA in print land, and it can be pushed aggressively for fun, so no more complaints about film being a poor candidate for indoor portraits. Just be wary of color balance, so traditional white fluorescent bulbs skew aggressively green, modern LEDs may not give a true tungsten color temperature, and any strobes you apply during your shot can be given a tungsten correction film like a CTO film over the strobe. This is not auto white balance fun time on your Nikon D3. So if you do want fast medium format lenses, there are cheaper 80mm f1.9 lenses available for the Mamiya 645 system. Supposedly they aren't too bad. The Hasselblad focal plane system will get you a stop. Again, the 110 f2, the 150 f2.8, and the 50 f2.8 are all a stop faster than equivalent C lenses, and you can expect to spend your left kidney on them. And also, before I made the jump to my own system, I did rent one from Glazer's Camera in Seattle twice, which was super fun. I would highly recommend you check out renting a kit, as it was like $40 for the weekend, and it was a great introduction. And, naturally, I ended up getting my own after a while. Thanks for watching today. I'm Nick with Nick Snacks. Until next time.